At 7:23 a.m. on July 5, 1943, Captain Alexander Pokrishkin dove his P-39 Airacobra toward a formation of German Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers approaching Soviet positions near Kursk. The Stukas were attacking at 6,000 feet altitude, low enough that German fighters couldn't effectively protect them without sacrificing their own altitude advantage. Pokrishkin's P-39, an American-built fighter that the U.S. Army Air Forces had rejected as underpowered and worthless above 12,000 feet, accelerated perfectly in the dive. At 4,000 feet, Pokrishkin opened fire with the 37mm cannon mounted in the aircraft's nose, a weapon American pilots complained was too slow firing and created too much recoil. The 37mm shell struck a Stuka's engine, the explosion tearing the entire engine from its mounts. The Stuka disintegrated immediately. Pokrishkin pulled out of his dive, climbed back to 8,000 feet using the P-39's excellent low-altitude climb rate, and engaged 2 more Stukas before German fighters could respond. Both Stukas went down, 3 kills in 4 minutes, using a fighter the Americans had declared unsuitable for combat. By day's end, Pokrishkin had shot down 5 German aircraft, bringing his total kills to 47. He would finish the war with 59 confirmed victories, making him the 3rd highest Soviet ace, flying an aircraft American pilots refused to fly in combat. The P-39 Airacobra, rejected by American forces as inadequate and relegated to training duties in the United States, became the Soviet Union's most effective fighter aircraft. Soviet pilots flying P-39s destroyed 5,156 German aircraft on the Eastern Front between 1942 and 1945, more than any other Allied fighter type in that theater. 48 Soviet pilots achieved A status flying exclusively P-39s, including multiple heroes of the Soviet Union, the USSR's highest military honor. The United States sent 4,619 P-39s to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, representing nearly half of all P-39 production. The Soviets desperately wanted more. American commanders couldn't understand why. The answer was simple. Americans and Soviets were fighting different wars at different altitudes using different tactics. Americans rejected the P-39 because it couldn't compete at high altitudes where American doctrine emphasized fighting. Soviets loved the P-39 because it excelled at low altitudes where Eastern Front combat actually occurred. Same aircraft, opposite assessments, based entirely on how and where it was used. The toy fighter Americans threw away became the weapon Soviet aces used to dominate German aviation. If you want to see how America's rejected fighter became the Soviet Union's deadliest aircraft, hit that like button. It helps us share these stories where perspective determines value. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're diving into the fighter that was perfect for a war Americans weren't fighting. Back to 1939 and the unusual design that looked revolutionary, but couldn't perform where Americans needed it. The Bell P-39 Airacobra was designed in 1937-1938 by Bell Aircraft Corporation based on a revolutionary concept. Mount the engine behind the pilot rather than in the nose. Conventional fighters placed the engine in the aircraft's nose, with the propeller directly attached to the engine. This configuration was simple and mechanically efficient but created problems. The heavy engine in the nose made the aircraft nose heavy, requiring careful weight distribution. The long propeller shaft created vibration issues, and mounting weapons alongside the engine was complicated because the propeller was in the way. Bell's chief designer, Robert Woods, proposed mounting the engine in the aircraft's center, behind the pilot, and driving the propeller through a long shaft running under the cockpit. This configuration offered several advantages. First, it allowed mounting a large caliber cannon directly in the propeller shaft, firing through the propeller hub with no synchronization needed. Second, it improved weight distribution, placing the heavy engine near the aircraft's center of gravity for better maneuverability. Third, it freed the nose for heavy armament without worrying about propeller interference. The U.S. Army Air Corps was interested because the cannon armament seemed promising. American fighters in 1938 used rifle-caliber machine guns, typically 30 caliber or 50 caliber weapons. European combat experience suggested heavier weapons were needed. The P-39's ability to mount a 37mm cannon, firing shells weighing 1.3 pounds at 2,000 feet per second, seemed like a significant advance. The Army ordered prototypes in 1939. The prototype XP-39, first flown in April 1939, demonstrated excellent performance. Maximum speed exceeded 390 miles per hour at 20,000 feet altitude. Rate of climb exceeded 3,000 feet per minute. Maneuverability was exceptional due to the central engine placement. The Army was impressed enough to order production aircraft in 1940. But between prototype and production, Army requirements changed in ways that crippled the aircraft's high-altitude performance. The original prototype included a turbosupercharger, a device that compressed air before it entered the engine, maintaining sea-level power at high altitudes. The turbosupercharger was essential for high-altitude performance because engine power decreases with altitude as air becomes thinner. At 20,000 feet, naturally aspirated engines produce approximately 40% of sea-level power. Turbosuperchargers compensated by compressing the thin air, allowing engines to produce near sea-level power even at high altitudes. The Army's Material Division, reviewing the design for production, removed the turbosupercharger. The decision was based on multiple factors. Turbosuperchargers in 1940 were unreliable, prone to failure, and required complex ducting that added weight and maintenance complexity. The Material Division calculated that eliminating the turbosupercharger would reduce production costs by approximately 15% and improve aircraft reliability. They believed the performance sacrifice would be acceptable because combat experience from the Spanish Civil War and early World War II suggested most air combat occurred below 15,000 feet, where turbosuperchargers weren't critical. This decision fundamentally changed the aircraft's performance characteristics. Without the turbosupercharger, the P-39's Allison V1710 engine produced excellent power at low altitudes, but rapidly lost power above 12,000 feet. At sea level, the engine produced 1,150 horsepower. At 5,000 feet, approximately 1,000 horsepower. At 10,000 feet, approximately 850 horsepower. At 15,000 feet, approximately 600 horsepower. At 20,000 feet, approximately 450 horsepower. Less than half sea level power. Above 15,000 feet, the P-39 couldn't maintain competitive performance against German fighters that retained good high-altitude capabilities. By 1941, when P-39s entered service, American tactical doctrine had evolved to emphasize high-altitude combat. Intelligence from European air combat indicated that German fighters typically engaged at altitudes between 18,000 and 25,000 feet, forcing Allied fighters to operate at those altitudes to maintain effectiveness. American fighter doctrine developed around high-altitude interception, long-range escort, and maintaining altitude advantage over enemy fighters. The P-39, optimized for low-altitude performance, didn't fit this doctrine. Technical specifications of the production P-39D, the primary variant used in American service, demonstrated both strengths and critical weaknesses. Length overall, 30 feet 2 inches, wingspan, 34 feet, height, 11 feet 10 inches, empty weight, 5,600 pounds, maximum takeoff weight, 7,650 pounds. Power plant, Allison V1710, 35 liquid-cooled, V12 engine producing, 150 horsepower at sea level. Performance at sea level was impressive. Maximum speed, 368 miles per hour. Rate of climb, 3,750 feet per minute. Service ceiling, officially 32,000 feet, but performance above 20,000 feet was marginal. Range, 650 miles maximum, approximately 400 miles combat radius. These specifications compared favorably to other fighters at low altitudes, but became increasingly inferior as altitude increased. At 20,000 feet, the P-39's maximum speed dropped to approximately 340 miles per hour, while the German Messerschmitt Bf 19F maintained 373 miles per hour. Rate of climb at 20,000 feet dropped to approximately 1,200 feet per minute, while the Bf 19F maintained 2,000 feet per minute. In combat above 15,000 feet, the P-39 was consistently outperformed by German fighters. Armament consisted of one 37mm M4 cannon firing through the propeller hub with 30 rounds, two 50 caliber machine guns in the nose with 200 rounds per gun, and four 30 caliber machine guns in the wings with 1,000 rounds per gun. The 37mm cannon was powerful when it hit, but fired slowly, approximately 140 rounds per minute, and created significant recoil that disrupted aim. American pilots complained that the 37mm was difficult to aim accurately and that ammunition load of only 30 rounds was insufficient for extended combat. American combat experience with the P-39 confirmed its limitations at high altitudes. During the Battle of Britain in 1940–41, the RAF briefly used P-39s, called Airacobra, in British service, and found them completely inadequate. German fighters engaged at 18,000 to 22,000 feet, where the P-39 couldn't compete. The RAF withdrew P-39s from combat after only a few missions, relegating them to training duties. In the Pacific theater, American forces used P-39s extensively in 1942 during the Guadalcanal campaign and New Guinea operations. The results were mixed. Against Japanese bombers at medium altitudes, the P-39 performed adequately, using its heavy armament to destroy bombers that couldn't outmaneuver it. But against Japanese, Zero fighters, particularly the A6M2 variant that dominated in 1942, the P-39 struggled. Zeros could outclimb P-39s above 10,000 feet and outturn them at all altitudes. American pilots flying P-39s suffered heavy casualties when engaging Zeros in prolonged dogfights. By mid-1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces had largely withdrawn P-39s from frontline combat units, replacing them with P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and F-51 Mustangs, all of which excelled at high-altitude combat. P-39s were relegated to training duties in the United States, used to teach new pilots basic fighter tactics before they transitioned to combat aircraft. American assessment of the P-39 was universally negative. One American fighter pilot's assessment, typical of the consensus view, stated, "The P-39 is a nice airplane for flying around at low altitude, shooting at ground targets or slow bombers. But in a real air combat situation against modern fighters, it's death trap. It can't climb fast enough, can't turn tight enough at altitude, and runs out of power above 15,000 feet. I wouldn't want to fight in a P-39 if I had any alternative." The Soviet Union had very different experiences and very different opinions. Soviet forces first received P-39s in early 1942 under the Lend-Lease program. Initial Soviet reactions were skeptical. The Soviets had requested high-altitude fighters to counter German bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. The P-39, with its poor high-altitude performance, seemed like an inadequate substitute for the Spitfires or P-51s they wanted. But Soviet pilots quickly discovered that Eastern Front air combat occurred at very different altitudes than combat in Western Europe or the Pacific. German and Soviet tactical aviation on the Eastern Front operated primarily at altitudes below 10,000 feet, often below 5,000 feet, supporting ground forces engaged in intense close-quarters combat. Strategic bombing played a smaller role in the East than in the West. Instead, aircraft attacked tanks, trucks, artillery, and troops near the front lines, requiring low-altitude operations where the P-39 excelled. At altitudes below 10,000 feet, the P-39 was among the best fighters in service with any air force. The Allison engine produced excellent power at low altitudes, giving the P-39 superior climb rate and acceleration compared to most German fighters below 10,000 feet. The central engine placement provided excellent maneuverability, allowing tight turns that German Bf-119s and FW-190s couldn't match at low altitudes. The 37mm cannon, criticized by American pilots, proved devastatingly effective against German aircraft when Soviet pilots learned to use it properly. Soviet tactical doctrine on the Eastern Front was perfectly suited to P-39 strengths. Soviet fighters typically operated between 3,000 and 8,000 feet altitude, attacking German ground attack aircraft, bombers, and fighters supporting German ground forces. At these altitudes, the P-39's performance was superior to German fighters. Soviet pilots developed tactics that maximized P-39 advantages, attacking from above when possible to gain speed, using the 37mm cannon for one-shot kills, and dogfighting at low altitudes where the P-39's maneuverability was best. Soviet pilots also appreciated features that American pilots criticized. The 37mm cannon, which Americans complained fired too slowly, was praised by Soviets who valued its destructive power. Soviet pilots trained to fire single, precise bursts rather than sustained fire, making the 30-round ammunition load adequate. The tricycle landing gear, unusual for fighters in 1942, was praised for making landings easier and reducing accidents, particularly important on rough Soviet airfields. Alexander Pokrishkin, who became the Soviet Union's third-ranking ace with 59 confirmed victories, flew P-39s almost exclusively from 1943 until war's end. His tactical manual, written for Soviet pilots transitioning to P-39s, emphasized the aircraft's strengths and how to exploit them while avoiding situations that exposed its weaknesses. Pokrishkin's innovations transformed the P-39 from an aircraft Soviet pilots initially distrusted into the most feared fighter in Soviet service. Pokrishkin received his first P-39 in April 1943, replacing the Yak-1 he had flown during 1942. His initial impression was negative, echoing American criticisms. The tricycle landing gear seemed fragile compared to conventional tailwheel designs. The 37mm cannon's slow rate of fire seemed inadequate compared to the rapid-firing machine guns on Soviet fighters. The aircraft's performance above 12,000 feet was noticeably inferior to German fighters at those altitudes. But Pokrishkin recognized that criticisms based on high-altitude performance missed the point. Eastern Front combat occurred at low altitudes where the P-39's characteristics were advantages, not liabilities. His first P-39 combat mission occurred on May 6, 1943, near Krimskaya, in support of Soviet ground forces attacking German positions. The mission involved escorting Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft operating at 4,000 feet altitude. German Messerschmitt Bf 109G fighters attacked the Sturmoviks from 8,000 feet, diving through the Soviet fighter escort. Pokrishkin, flying at 6,000 feet, spotted the diving German fighters and initiated his own dive to intercept them. The engagement demonstrated the P-39's low-altitude advantages immediately. Pokrishkin dove from 6,000 feet to 4,500 feet, accelerating to over 400 miles per hour in the dive. He positioned himself 300 meters behind a Bf 109G that was lining up on a Sturmovik. The P-39's dive acceleration was excellent, allowing Pokrishkin to close rapidly despite the German pilot's attempts to evade. At 250 meters range, Pokrishkin fired a 2-second burst from the 37mm cannon, 3 shells total. The first shell missed, the second struck the Bf 109's fuselage behind the cockpit, and the third hit the engine. The German fighter exploded, falling in flames. Total engagement time, 11 seconds from initial dive to kill. Pokrishkin pulled out of his dive at 3,500 feet and immediately began climbing, using the P-39's excellent low-altitude climb rate to regain altitude advantage. A second Bf 109G attempted to engage him during the climb, but the German pilot couldn't match the P-39's climb rate below 8,000 feet. Pokrishkin outclimbed the German fighter, reversed, and attacked from above, damaging the Bf 109 with machine gun fire. The German pilot broke off and withdrew. Mission result: 1 confirmed kill, 1 damaged, 0 Soviet losses, mission accomplished. This engagement became the template for Pokrishkin's tactical system. He developed a 4-phase attack profile that maximized P-39 strengths while minimizing exposure to German fighters' high-altitude advantages. The system, called Kuban formula, after the region where he perfected it, became standard doctrine for Soviet P-39 units by late 1943. Phase 1. Height advantage and observation. P-39s would patrol at 10,000 to 12,000 feet, above the 6,000 to 8,000 feet altitude where German ground attack aircraft and bombers typically operated. This altitude was high enough to observe German formations and initiate attacks from above, but low enough that the P-39 retained good performance. Pokrishkin emphasized patience, waiting for optimal attack opportunities rather than engaging immediately. Phase 2. High-speed dive attack. Upon identifying targets, P-39s would dive from patrol altitude, accelerating to maximum speed. The dive served multiple purposes. It increased speed for better gun platform stability, increased closure rate making the attacker difficult to track, and positioned the attacker to continue past the target and escape before enemy fighters could respond. Pokryshkin taught pilots to dive at 45 to 60-degree angles, steeper than typical fighter attacks, but necessary to maximize speed advantage. Phase 3. Precision cannon fire. At ranges between 200 and 300 meters, the attacking pilot would fire the 37mm cannon in short, precise bursts. Pokryshkin emphasized that the 37mm cannon required different gunnery techniques than machine guns. Machine guns could be hosed onto targets with sustained fire, relying on volume of fire to achieve hits. The 37mm slow rate of fire and limited ammunition required precise aim and triggered discipline. Pokryshkin taught pilots to fire 1 to 3 shell bursts, aiming for specific aim points: engine for bombers, cockpit, or engine for fighters. A single 37mm hit was often sufficient to destroy or cripple the target. Phase 4. Escape and repositioning. After attacking, the pilot would continue the dive past the target, using gained speed to extend away from enemy fighters before they could respond. Once clear, the pilot would climb back to patrol altitude for another attack. Pokryshkin emphasized never entering prolonged turning fights at low altitude where numbers favored the enemy. Hit-and-run tactics, repeated multiple times per mission, achieved better results with lower losses than traditional dogfighting. The effectiveness of Pokryshkin's tactics was demonstrated during the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. During the first week of the battle, Pokryshkin's regiment, flying P-39s using his tactics, achieved 57 confirmed kills against 7 losses, an 8.1 kill ratio that far exceeded typical Soviet performance. Pokryshkin personally achieved 11 kills during this week, including the 5 kills on July 5th mentioned in the opening. His success prompted Soviet Air Force Command to document his tactics and distribute them to other P-39 units. By August 1943, Pokryshkin's 4-phase attack profile was being taught at Soviet fighter training schools. Units transitioning to P-39s received dedicated training in these tactics before deployment. The systematic adoption of Pokryshkin's methods dramatically improved Soviet P-39 performance. Across the entire force, Pokryshkin's tactics were adopted widely in Soviet aviation. The standard Soviet P-39 attack profile involved 4 distinct phases. First, achieve altitude advantage, typically climbing to 10,000 to 12,000 feet above expected enemy altitude. Second, identify targets and initiate dive, accelerating to maximum speed. Third, close to 200 to 300 meters, aim carefully, and fire 1 to 3 rounds from the 37mm cannon. Fourth, continue diving past the target. Use gained speed to extend away from enemy fighters, then climb back to altitude for another attack. This profile maximized P-39 strengths while avoiding prolonged turning fights where German fighters might gain advantage. The effectiveness of Soviet P-39 tactics is documented in meticulous Soviet combat records. Between 1942 and 1945, Soviet pilots flying P-39s achieved 5,156 confirmed air victories against German aircraft. This represents approximately 12% of all Soviet air victories during the war, achieved with an aircraft type that represented approximately 8% of Soviet fighter strength. The kill-to-loss ratio for Soviet P-39 units averaged approximately 1.8.1, meaning Soviet P-39 pilots shot down 1.8 German aircraft for every P-39 lost. This was among the best ratios achieved by any Soviet fighter type, and far exceeded the approximately 0.7.1 ratio American P-39 units achieved in the Pacific. 48 Soviet pilots achieved ace status, 5 or more victories, flying exclusively P-39s. Multiple Soviet heroes of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military decoration, earned their honors flying P-39s. Grigory Rechkalov achieved 56 victories in P-39s, becoming the second-ranking Soviet ace. Nikolai Gulayev achieved 55 victories in P-39s. Alexander Klubov achieved 50 victories. Dmitry Glinka achieved 50 victories. The list of successful P-39 aces demonstrates that the aircraft's performance in Soviet hands was exceptional, not anomalous. The contrast between American and Soviet experiences with the P-39 was so stark that American commanders initially didn't believe Soviet reports. When Soviet representatives requested more P-39s through Lend-Lease channels in 1943, American officers thought the Soviets were being polite about an inferior aircraft, rather than genuinely wanting more. Only when Soviet aces visited American bases and described their tactics did Americans begin understanding that the Soviets were fighting a completely different air war. Statistical comparison of P-39 performance in American versus Soviet service quantifies the differences. American P-39 squadrons in the Pacific achieved approximately 0.7 enemy aircraft destroyed per P-39 lost, meaning they lost more aircraft than they shot down. Soviet P-39 units achieved approximately 1.8 enemy aircraft destroyed per P-39 lost, a ratio 2.5 times better. Average altitude of American P-39 combat engagements, approximately 15,000 feet. Average altitude of Soviet P-39 combat engagements, approximately 6,000 feet. The 9,000-foot altitude difference explained most of the performance disparity. Aircraft survivability data reveals additional insights. American P-39s in combat had average service life of approximately 35 combat missions before being shot down, damaged beyond repair, or written off due to accidents. Soviet P-39s averaged approximately 62 combat missions before loss. The difference reflected both the lower altitude combat environment in the East and Soviet maintenance practices that kept aircraft operational despite damage that would have grounded them in American service. The Lend-Lease delivery of P-39s to the Soviet Union represented one of the largest single aircraft transfers in history and one of the most logistically complex operations of World War II. The United States produced 9,558 P-39s total between 1941 and 1944. Of these, 4,019 were delivered to the Soviet Union, representing 49.4% of total production. An additional 675 were delivered to other Allied nations, including Britain, Australia, and Free French forces. Approximately 4,000 served with American forces, mostly in training roles. The majority of P-39 combat service occurred with Soviet forces, not American forces, making the P-39 primarily a Soviet fighter, despite being American-designed and built. Delivery of P-39s to the Soviet Union occurred via 3 major routes, each with distinct challenges and risks. The Alaska-Siberia route, known as ALSIB, involved flying aircraft from manufacturing plants in the United States to Great Falls, Montana, where American pilots delivered them to Ladd Field near Fairbanks, Alaska. Soviet pilots then flew the aircraft across the Bering Strait to Siberia, navigating over some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. From Siberia, the aircraft were flown westward across 6,000 miles of Soviet territory to reach the front lines. The ALSIB route delivered approximately 2,600 P-39s between 1942 and 1945. The route was operational year-round but was particularly dangerous during winter when temperatures dropped to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and visibility was often zero. Soviet pilots, many of them women from the 1st Ferry Division, flew the route despite conditions that would have grounded commercial aviation. The ferry pilots were not combat pilots, but specialists in long-distance navigation and instrument flying. They delivered not just P-39s, but also A-20 bombers, C-47 transports, and other Lend-Lease aircraft. Approximately 133 aircraft were lost on the ALSIB route due to weather, navigation errors, or mechanical failures. This represented approximately 5% of aircraft ferried, a remarkably low loss rate given the extreme conditions. The Soviet ferry pilots developed techniques for surviving forced landings in Siberian wilderness, including carrying survival equipment and emergency supplies. Several pilots survived crashes in remote areas and walked hundreds of miles to reach civilization, taking weeks or months to return. The Persian corridor route involved shipping disassembled P-39s from American ports to Persian Gulf ports, primarily Basra in Iraq and Bandar Shahpur in Iran. The aircraft were transported by truck convoy through Iran to Soviet territory, then reassembled at Soviet Air Force facilities near the Iranian border. Soviet mechanics would reassemble the aircraft, test fly them, and then ferry them to the front. This route delivered approximately 1,800 P-39s. The route was slower than Olseep because disassembly, shipping, and reassembly added months to delivery time. But it was safer from German interdiction because it passed through territories firmly under Allied control. The primary risks were from extreme heat in the Persian Gulf region, which caused maintenance challenges, and from mountainous terrain in Iran that made truck transport difficult. The reassembly process at Soviet facilities was remarkably efficient. Soviet mechanics, working without original, factory documentation in many cases, learned to reassemble P-39s in approximately 72 hours per aircraft. They developed improvised tools and techniques for dealing with parts that didn't fit perfectly, often filing down components or fabricating replacement parts from local materials when American parts were damaged during shipping. The Arctic convoy route was the most dangerous, delivering approximately 300 P-39s via ships to Murmansk in northern Soviet Union. These aircraft were shipped fully assembled or partially disassembled in crates aboard merchant ships that ran the gauntlet of German submarine and air attacks. The Arctic convoys suffered heavy casualties, with some convoys losing 30 to 40% of ships to German attacks. P-39s aboard sunken ships were total losses, making this route expensive despite the shorter delivery time compared to other routes. One Arctic convoy, PQ-17, lost 24 of 35 ships to German attacks in July 1942. Among the lost cargo were approximately 200 fighter aircraft, including P-39s, P-40s, and Hurricanes. The loss was catastrophic for Soviet forces expecting those aircraft to equip new fighter units. The disaster led to temporary suspension of Arctic convoys and increased reliance on ALSIB and Persian routes for aircraft delivery. Soviet reception of Lend-Lease P-39s involved extensive modification before the aircraft entered combat service. Soviet Air Force engineers recognized that American aircraft were designed for American operational conditions and required adaptation for Soviet use. The modifications fell into several categories. First, fuel system modifications. American P-39s were designed to use 100-octane aviation fuel, which was unavailable in the Soviet Union. Soviet fuel was typically 93 octane or lower. Soviet engineers modified fuel systems and engine settings to operate on lower-grade fuel, accepting slight performance reductions to enable use of available fuel. This involved adjusting carburetor settings, modifying ignition timing, and sometimes reducing compression ratios. The modifications reduced engine power by approximately 5 to 8%, but made the aircraft operational with Soviet logistics. Second, cold weather modifications. Soviet winters reached temperatures that American aircraft weren't designed for. Soviet engineers added engine preheaters that warmed engines before starting, preventing damage from cold start attempts. They modified oil systems to use thinner oil that flowed at lower temperatures. They added cockpit heaters using exhaust heat, improving pilot comfort and reducing frostbite injuries. They even experimented with ski landing gear for snow operations, though this proved impractical for fighters that needed quick scrambling. Third, armament modifications. Some Soviet units removed the wing-mounted 30-caliber machine guns, which they considered ineffective, and added additional 50-caliber guns or Soviet-made weapons. Others retained the original armament, but installed Soviet gun sights calibrated for Soviet ammunition when American ammunition was unavailable. The 37mm cannon was universally retained because Soviet pilots considered it the P-39's most valuable weapon. Fourth, radio modifications. American radios operated on different frequencies than Soviet radios, creating coordination problems. Soviet engineers installed Soviet radios in P-39s, allowing communication with Soviet ground controllers and other Soviet aircraft. The American radios were sometimes retained as backup systems, sometimes removed to save weight. Soviet modifications to P-39s demonstrated their commitment to maximizing the aircraft's effectiveness. Soviet engineers developed improved gun sights specifically calibrated for the 37mm cannon's ballistics, increasing hit probability. They modified fuel systems to use lower-grade Soviet fuel instead of the high-octane American fuel the aircraft was designed for. They developed cold-weather modifications, including engine, preheaters, and improved winterization for operations in temperatures reaching -40 degrees Celsius. They even experimented with ski landing gear for operations from snow-covered fields, though this proved impractical. Soviet training for P-39 pilots emphasized different skills than American training. American fighter pilot training in 1942-43 focused on high-altitude tactics, energy management, and long-range navigation for bomber escort missions. Soviet P-39 training focused on low-altitude maneuvering, precision gunnery with the 37mm cannon, and coordination with ground forces. Soviet pilots typically receive 50 to 80 hours of training in P-39s before deployment, compared to American pilots' 30 to 40 hours. The additional training reflected Soviet recognition that the P-39 required different techniques than Soviet-built fighters. German pilots' assessments of the P-39, based on combat encounters and examination of captured aircraft, were mixed but generally respected thus. Aircraft when flown by skilled pilots at appropriate altitudes. German tactical manuals from 1943 warned pilots that Soviet P-39s were dangerous opponents below 8,000 feet, and recommended engaging them at higher altitudes where German fighters retained performance advantages. One Luftwaffe combat report noted, "The American Airacobra in Soviet hands is effective low-altitude fighter. Its cannon armament is dangerous, and its maneuverability at low altitude is good. Recommend engagement above 10,000 feet, where our fighters maintain performance advantage." Post-war analysis by American and Soviet historians has examined why the same aircraft performed so differently in different hands. The consensus explanation focuses on three factors: altitude of combat operations, tactical doctrine matching aircraft capabilities, and pilot training emphasizing appropriate skills. The P-39 was designed as a low-altitude fighter, but was rejected by Americans who needed high-altitude capability. Soviets, fighting at low altitudes, found an aircraft perfectly suited to their needs. Modern aerospace historians use the P-39 as a case study in how aircraft performance depends critically on operational environment. An aircraft isn't inherently good or bad. It's suitable or unsuitable for specific missions and specific conditions. The P-39 was unsuitable for high-altitude combat in Western Europe, but was excellent for low-altitude combat on the Eastern Front. American rejection and Soviet adoption were both correct decisions based on their respective operational requirements. The P-39 remained in Soviet service through the end of the war in May 1945, with some units continuing to fly them into 1946. The aircraft was gradually retired as Soviet-built fighters incorporating lessons from the P-39 entered service. Many Soviet P-39 aces transitioned to Yak-9 or LA-7 fighters in late 1944 and 1945, but several, including Pokryshkin, flew P-39s through the war's final battles. Alexander. Pokryshkin survived the war and continued serving in the Soviet Air Force, rising to the rank of Marshal of Aviation before retiring in 1968. He died in 1985 at age 71, honored as one of the Soviet Union's greatest military heroes. His autobiography, published in 1960, includes extensive discussion of the P-39 and his tactical innovations with the aircraft. He wrote, "American pilots did not understand the Airacobra. They tried to use it like a high-altitude interceptor, which it was not. We used it as a low-altitude attack fighter, which it was. The aircraft was not inadequate. It was misunderstood. The total of 5,156 German aircraft destroyed by Soviet P-39 pilots represents one of the most successful fighter deployments of World War II. To put this number in context, the entire German Luftwaffe lost approximately 76,000 aircraft of all types on all fronts during the war. Soviet P-39s accounted for approximately 7% of total German aircraft losses, achieved by approximately 8% of Soviet fighter force. The aircraft that Americans called a toy fighter and relegated to training duties became one of the war's most successful fighters when used appropriately. 1939 was when Bell designed the P-39 with revolutionary mid-engine configuration. 1940 was when the Army removed the turbosupercharger, crippling high-altitude performance. 1941 was when American forces rejected it as inadequate for combat. 1942 was when Soviets began receiving P-39s and discovered they were perfect for low-altitude Eastern Front combat. 1943 was when Pokryshkin developed tactics that made Soviet P-39 pilots among the war's deadliest. 1945 was when the war ended with 5,156 German aircraft destroyed by P-39s Americans had thrown away. One aircraft, two completely opposite assessments, rejected by Americans as worthless, embraced by Soviets as excellent, 5,156 German aircraft destroyed, 48 Soviet aces, proved that perspective determines value and that one nation's trash is another. Nation's treasure when used correctly, not because the aircraft changed, because how it was used changed. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support preserves these histories of weapons that succeeded by finding the right war. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We honor those who recognize value others missed. Thank you for keeping their stories alive.